What's up? Welcome to Four Downs alongside Zac Elder and Daniel Carp. I'm Daniel Nolan, and we're here to preview this weekend's action against Troy. But before we get to that, University of Pittsburgh last weekend, 113 total points scored by both teams. But Dan, 58 points allowed by this Duke defense. They've got some serious holes.
Absolutely, Danny. It was one of the worst efforts that we've seen from Duke defense in the David Cutcliffe era last week. 598 yards of offense that they allowed Pittsburgh to score. Now, the bright side of that is that they let up 468 of those in the first half. So the second half was much improved, but at the same time, Coach Cut said this week that they definitely have to limit the explosive plays. He identified 17 snaps the Duke played on defense where they let up 423 yards. That's an average of almost 25 yards a play. Now, on the flip side, that means that of the other 62 defensive snaps that Duke played, they only allowed 2.8 yards a play. If Duke wants to beat Troy this weekend, they got to be much closer to that 2.8 yards a play than to 25.
And Zach, an explosive offensive system for Troy as well. We're not just talking about Georgia Tech and Pittsburgh the last 2 weeks. Troy can actually score as well.
Well, Troy has some weapons on the offensive end, and their biggest weapon is a wide receiver named Eric Thomas. He has 17 catches on the year, not a whole lot of catches through 4 games, but 6 of those are for touchdowns. This guy's a playmaker, and is going to be somebody who the Duke secondary really needs to watch out for.
And one of the other things that's going to be interesting when you look at Troy's offense is how Duke's defense is able to deal with a 2-quarterback system that Troy runs. Troy has 2 different quarterbacks that they'll use throughout the game. One, Corey Robinson, is primarily a passer. The other one, Deion Anthony, primarily a runner. Now, for a Duke defense that's used to playing against Anthony Boone and Brandon Kennett when Anthony Boone was healthy and practice every day, shouldn't be too difficult. That being said, Robinson has been tearing up opposing defenses through the air this year. He's completing more than 72% of his passes. So for a Duke defense that let up that many explosive plays through the air last week, could be a tough test.
So speaking of offense, Dan, Brandon Kennett had a great week last week, coming off a performance that was pretty subpar at best, 14 points against Georgia Tech, 55 last week, had 4 picks, but he also had 300 yards passing and 100 yards rushing. What Brandon Kennett are we going to see this weekend?
I think the big difference from Brandon Kennett last week to Brandon Kennett against Georgia Tech was how aggressive he was making his throws. He wasn't just staying in that short and intermediate passing game. He was throwing the ball down the field, and he was doing it with confidence. Now, the 4 interceptions is clearly something that Duke is going to want to try to reduce this week. They were what really broke the team's back, especially the 2 that came in the fourth quarter last week against Pittsburgh. But I think they'd much rather have Brandon Kennett taking his shots, trying to make big plays, and putting up 50, 55 points against Troy this week than being really conservative and putting up the 14 that he did against Georgia Tech.
I'll tell you what, something that's really going to help Brandon Kennett build his confidence is having number 3, Jamison Crowder, lined up at wide receiver. Crowder last weekend had a rushing touchdown, a reception touchdown, and a punt return touchdown. The first Blue Devil to do that since his own wide receivers coach, Scotty Montgomery, did it back in the 1990s.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about 279 all-purpose yards last week for Jamison Crowder. He's just separating himself right now as an elite receiver, an elite returner, an elite playmaker in the ACC. And after he was kind of overshadowed by Connor Vernon last year, was still as statistically efficient as Vernon was. But the question this year was, how is Jamison Crowder going to react to being the guy, the primary playmaker in Duke's offense? I would say he's responded really well.
So perhaps All-American status for Crowder, but we'll have to see where that goes the rest of the season. For this weekend against Troy, what do you see happening?
My advice to all gamblers out there, take the over this week. You're talking about an over-under that's going to be around 45 points. A Duke team that scored 55 against Pittsburgh last week against a Troy team that let up 62 against Mississippi State. There's going to be a lot of points scored. It's going to be a high-paced game, really fun for fans to watch. I think Duke's offense continues to shine, and the defense gets to put it together a little bit more, maybe lets up an explosive play or 2, but I still think the Blue Devils take it 44-28.
I don't see Duke losing 3 games in a row, especially against a non-conference opponent like Troy. I think they bounce back this week. I've got the Blue Devils 42-14.
Breaking that 2-game losing streak, getting back over 500 for the Blue Devils if they win this weekend against Troy. Once again, for Zac Elder and Daniel Carp, I'm Danny Nolan. We'll see you guys later.